All right, let's go. This is video 3 for chapter 3. It goes kind of connected with section 3.2. It's an extension onto that. So in this video, we're going to learn how to factor an expression by dividing out a greatest common factor. So GCF, when we say GCF, we know that is greatest common factor. So let's think about the words. Greatest means the biggest or the largest. Common means something that they share. And then factor. A factor is something you multiply together to make a product. So I'll give you an example. Factors of 6. 2 and 3 are factors of 6. 2 times 3 makes 6. So the 2 and the 3 are both factors. So when we ask for a greatest common factor, and this is review from when you learned it probably with fractions years ago, but a GCF means, okay, what's the biggest thing that goes into both of these numbers? So, well, 2, there's only 1 and 2. And 10, there's 1, 2, 5, and 10. So what's the biggest thing that they share? Well, the 2. So when you learned this before, you probably listed all these factors out, or you did factor trees. Well, by now, we hope you know your multiplication facts well enough that you can just think about what goes into 2, what goes into 10, and what do they share, or what do they have in common. Okay? So I'll do a couple more. What goes into 3, what goes into 24, and what do they both share? Okay? Well, in this one, it's 3. 3 goes into 3, 3 goes into 24. It's the biggest thing that goes into both of them. 9 and 27, it's 9, right? If I think about numbers I can multiply together to make 9 and 27, they both share 9. So oftentimes it is just the smaller number out of your set, but not always. So here's an example. 16 and 20. Well, it's not 16. 16 doesn't go into 20. So I got to think about other ways to make 16. 4 times 4, and for 20 I can do 4 times 5. So I see that they share the 4. Is there anything bigger? Well, 8 and 2, but neither 8, well 2 does, but that's not bigger. 8 doesn't go into 20, so 4 is my biggest common factor there. So maybe you have a multiplication chart out, maybe you're just using your mental math facts and finding the biggest number that goes into both of your numbers here. Okay, so there are 4 more for you to try. Pause these, do them, or pause here and do these 4 and come back and check when you're ready with the GCF. So 7 goes into both 14 and 49. 6 goes into 24 and 42. 10 and 5. And if you find this kind of challenging, then go back to making your factor trees or go back to listing out all the possible factors if you want. But really, we're just kind of in our head figuring out, okay, what's the biggest thing that goes into both of them? So we're going to use that greatest common factor idea now as we factor. So we said to factor an expression, we divide out the greatest common factor. So we've got to figure out what the greatest common factor is for both terms. So I'm looking at 24 and 18. Okay, what goes into both of those? 6. 6 goes into 24. So this would be 6 times 4 times x. And 6 goes into 18. 6 times 3 makes 18. So 6 is the common factor that they share. So I'm going to pull that common factor out front, divide it out, and then in the parentheses, I'm going to say, okay, what's left for this term? I still have a 4 and an x. And what's left for this term? A 3. And then I'm looking at my sign here, and this was a negative 18, so there's a negative, negative 3 there. And the way to check this is to distribute it back. 6 times 4x is 24x. 6 times negative 3 is negative 18. So you should always get your original expression back again. Let's do another one. 12z plus 40. Well, what goes into 12 and 40? I'm thinking 3. So this would be 4 times 3 times z. This would be 4 times 10. Well, if I find that common factor is 4, and I pull it out front, and then I'm going to write what's left from this term was the 3z, and what's left from this term is a 10. And everything's positive, so put a plus sign. I want to check that, so I'm going to distribute back. 4 times 3z is 12z, and 4 times 10 is 40. So I got that expression back again. That's how we check our answer. So I want you to try the next two. Figure out what your greatest common factor is, and that goes out front. And then whatever's left for each of those terms gets written down inside the parentheses. Figure out your GCF, and that goes in front. And then whatever's left from each of those terms goes in the parentheses. So pause here and try those. Hit play when you're ready to check. Okay, let's check our answers. I divided out a 3. So 3 times 2x is 6x. 3 times 9 is 27. Yep, that works. And here, 21y minus 14. Very good. All right, on to the next page. There's one more little twist to these. What about when I have a negative in the front of my expression? So, still thinking about a greatest common factor for 3 and 12. Okay, 3. So this is a negative and a 3 and an x. And then my 12 is a 3 and a 4. Well, if I use that 3 as my common factor, pull it out front, the trick is if this first number is a negative, I want my GCF, my common factor that I pulled out, to also be a negative. So I'm going to take that negative 3 and make it the common factor, which means I just have x left here. And if I take 12 and I divide out a negative 3, that means this has to be a negative 4, because a negative 3 times a negative 4 gives me that positive 12 back. And if that's confusing, you can always just double check. Negative 3x, positive 12. Distribute it back again. Let me do another one. Negative 6 and 3. Well, I know I'm going to use 3 as my greatest common factor. So this is a negative, a 3, a 2, and an x. And this is just a 3. But because my first term is negative, I want to pull out a negative 3 as my GCF. So this is my GCF. That means I have 2x left for this first term. And if I pull out a negative 3, then that has to be multiplied by a negative 1 in order to make 3. So I'm always just thinking a little bit more about this sign here. A negative times a negative is going to give me positive 3. And distribute to check. Negative 3 times 2x is negative 6x. Negative 3 times negative 1 is 3. Yep. So I'm going to do these two more because these are a little confusing and you'll get to practice down here. 3 and 12. This is funny that all of these are a GCF of negative 3. So let me pull that out and then see what's left. Well, this is a negative 3 times x. And this would be a negative 3 times a negative 4 to make positive 12. So double check, negative 3x, and negative times negative is positive 12. Good. This one should be 5, negative 5. I'm going to list my factors out here. Negative 5 times 4 times x there, and negative 5 times 7 to make 35. So I see that they share that negative 5. So I'm going to write that as my GCF out front. And then inside the parentheses here would be 4 and x. And inside the parentheses here would be the 7. Now I have positive 7. Let's double check it before we move on. Negative 5 times 4 is negative 20x. And negative 5 times 7 is negative 35. Good. So pay attention to the signs, the positive and negatives, and distribute. distribute back again. Use your arrows to go back and check it. You should always get your original expression back again. You are going to find and fix so many mistakes if you make sure to double check yourself. Okay? So there are, 8 more questions here. I want to point out just a couple things. This one, if I'm looking at this, I'm probably going to pull out an 8. I know 8 goes into 16, and I know 8 goes into 32. So if I write 8 as my GCF, 8 times 2D makes 16D, and 8 times negative 4 makes negative 32. Now the problem with this one, the reason I put a star by this one, is because if you'll notice, 2 and 4 still actually have a common factor that I could pull out. Again, I could keep going. So because I can still pull a 2 out of here, that tells me that this wasn't actually the greatest common factor. Okay, so if I still pull a 2 out, then that really gives me the greatest common factor of 16. So I'm going to pull 16 as my greatest common factor. 16 times D and 16 times negative 2. So just be careful. If you think you factored it and there is actually still a common factor between these things in the parentheses, then you're not yet done. You did not factor it all the way. Okay, you're going to have to think about a bigger GCF that could have been pulled out. Okay? All right, so try these. Remember, if your first term is a negative, like this, then you need to have a negative in your GCF that you pull out front. First term is a negative, you have a negative in your GCF. First term is negative, negative in your GCF. So there are 4 where you should have a negative out front. Okay, pause the video here. Come back when you have those 7, you've tried them, and you're ready to check them. So do this practice before you hit play. Okay, actually check these here, please. So I pulled out a negative 5, and I can distribute back and check. Careful with your signs. This should say 35, so I pulled out a 7. Draw your arrows and distribute back and check. And here's your bottom row. Pause if you need to look at these for another minute. Fix them if you made a mistake. That is factoring.